Thank you, everybody, for dialing in. We'll go ahead and get started. I suspect that there will be some more people trickling in, but we want to respect the time of everybody who tuned in right away. So, really looking forward to the conversation today. Trevor and I were connected a handful of months ago by a mentor of mine who's a mutual friend. And we were connected around this research that he was doing on the topic of eldership. And previously I'd served in a role where I was a research associate for the head of research at Harvard Business School, and along with her and a handful of my peers, we were co-creating a course called Crafting Your Life, which was all about helping individuals live with intentionality. And as a part of that, I did about 120 interviews of Harvard alumni and revolving around how their lives unfolded, the major trade-offs and decisions they had to make. And if I had to distill that research down into one word, it would be intentionality. And it was interesting when I was speaking with Trevor about this research on eldership. I think the level of intentionality in terms of really thinking of this entirely additional chapter of life and what that looks like. So, just to kick things off, it would be great if you could just share more with us about your background and this research that you've done on the topic of eldership over the years.
Great. Thank you, Tristan, and welcome everyone from around the world. I think most people are either in Europe or America, I think some in Asia, but great to see you all. And you see, I live with a map of the world behind me, and that is to ensure perspective, is that everything we do is within a much bigger context. So the first question I was asked about, share a bit more about your own background. So I think I was converted to leadership when I was about 18 years old. It was a very real experience of beginning to see the power of leadership to transform the world. And it was an issue that was already in my mind, is what can you do to change the world? And that was followed very quickly on. I worked in Europe in international youth work, and I think I worked with some of the most outstanding leaders that I've ever met in terms of what they were doing. So I was shaped very early around this transformational power of leadership. And it led to a whole another set of stories. So I have worked in the not-for-profit, the public, and the corporate world in developing leaders. I guess over the last 47 years, that really is the theme, is what does it mean to develop leaders? And within that, I have founded and led 3 non-profit and for-profit organizations across the time. But I guess where the eldership story begins, one is I actually knew in my early 20s that aspiring to eldership was really, really important. So there was a story there in itself. But in 2004, I published my first book, which was called The 18 Challenges of Leadership. And that came out of researching hundreds and hundreds of hours of executive coaching with leaders on what are the actual challenges that leaders face when the door is shut between their world and this coaching conversation. Because what we discovered was, my colleague and I, is what people actually wanted to talk about was not what the textbooks were telling them to be talking about. So that's where we distilled the 18 challenges. What is it actually leaders want to talk about when the door is shut? So when that book was published, I kind of said, well, what next? And that's really where this journey began, that's opened up over the last couple of decades, because 2 things happened in parallel at that one of those points. The first thing was this, is I started thinking, well, the book was about leadership. Where do you go next? And my sense of leadership is, it's not that you move towards the horizon, it's that you create the horizon. You look beyond the horizon. You don't move towards the future as a leader, you create the future. So I thought on that basis, started thinking, well, what are we not asking about leadership? And I've grown up in a world where the only books on the bookshelves in the shops were on management. And then suddenly there was 5 or 6 books on leadership. And now there's 5 or 6,000 books on leadership. So suddenly this whole thing of leadership exploded. And I began to ask myself, everyone's talking like leadership is the top of the mountain. But what if it isn't? What if there is something beyond leadership? So that's where I started digging in and researching. And it was book research, talking research. I remember my eldest son and I, we went into the Rwenzori Mountains and the border of the Congo and Uganda to try and interview the elders there. So in lots of different ways, I was trying to understand this thing that was emerging called eldership, in that something has always existed beyond leadership. I don't mean for the last 50 or 100 years. I mean, I'm talking thousands of years. Something has always existed beyond leadership, and it's called eldership. And now, as I did that, my only experience of eldership was within religious settings, and I can't say that it was entirely favorable experiences. So I began to look, well, what does this word eldership mean? So that began that journey of research there that ended up in the book To Plant a Walnut Tree, which was the first of the actual books I wrote then on eldership. But in parallel with that, out of my leadership world came a conversation one day with a friend called Ian in London. And we were chatting because Ian ran a small charity doing little projects in different countries around the world. So I asked him, tell me what you're doing, Ian. Tell me about the different projects in different countries. One of the projects he told me about was in Zambia. He said on the edge of Lusaka, the capital of Zambia, there is this little township caught in extreme poverty. They need a school. And how do we get a school there? So we talked that conversation. I said to him at the end of it, Ian, just as a matter of interest, how much would it cost to set up and run a school? And he said it would cost £2,000 to set it up and run it for a year. And which I thought was crazy. So I said, gosh, you could do all of that for £2,000, $3,000. He said, yeah, absolutely. And so I said, here's the money, go. So I said to him a few months later, I said, how's it going? You know, let me know, and we maybe can talk about ongoing funding. He said, no, I need to go out there and look for myself. So I said, great, well, let me know when you come back and we can talk. He said, no, you're coming with me. Very wise man. And at that point, the nearest I'd got to extreme poverty was watching comic relief or programs like that on television. So I said, well, there's nothing I can offer. And he said, no, you're coming. So I went with him, and that was the beginning of 2005. And I had what I think they call is a Damascus Road experience. So at that time, the impact of HIV/AIDS was at its highest. So all I saw was little orphans walking and wandering around the streets and their grandparents, because that whole middle generation pretty much had died. And I revisited there last year, and even now you can see the massive difference positively in what's being created there. But I remember saying to our guide, whose name was Alfred, I said to Alfred, I pointed to a little girl scratching in the dirt. I said, how often does she get to eat? And he said she probably gets one meal every 2 or 3 days. And it broke my heart, literally broke my heart. And I just thought, this is not thought, I felt this is not okay. This is not okay. And I thought, what's going to happen? How are we going to help people get out of extreme poverty? Because they were waiting for the cavalry to arrive with trickle-down economics. I knew that wasn't going to happen. I thought the only way they're going to get out of poverty is if they learn to lead themselves out of poverty. But I knew no one from the corporate world was ever going to bring leadership development to a place like that. So I don't know where the idea came from, but it was just like, what if we could bring world-class leadership development into the world's most vulnerable communities? And that's where a journey began. And it's a whole other story of the founding and the leading of emerging leaders over the next decade and a half, which is now in over 20 countries. And I think by the end of this year, they'll have trained 90,000 people directly, indirect impact on, I think, about 2.5 to 3 million people. So that work keeps going. And that's important to me because that is part of my legacy, is the creation of that work that came out of standing in that slum that day. But I handed over the leadership to a great guy called Steve Miles and of Emerging Leaders 3 years ago, and 3 and a bit years ago. And I have focused then just on this question, what lies beyond leadership, and how do we engage an upcoming generation and my peers in this long lost issue of eldership. So, and part of that is Triston meant some research. I'm kind of running an ongoing piece of research at the moment where I'm just interviewing as many people as I can from around the world on their experiences of eldership. And some know absolutely nothing, some know a lot, but it's a fascinating piece of research which is beginning to turn into some other ideas and products. So I think that's really, Triston, kind of one thumbnail of the background that's brought us to this place today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the background context and would love to actually delve into, you mentioned that you've been having these ongoing conversations around eldership. And I
Yes.
know that, as I was, talking to people in my peer group, oftentimes they think much more about the concept of leadership and not so much about the concept of eldership. So it may be good to actually spend a bit of time doing some context setting. And I'd love to hear from you what you would describe as that definition of
Well,
eldership.
yeah, it's good and important question. So it doesn't surprise me that both you and I meet people who have no idea of this concept of eldership, and that's why I'm having conversations like this. Is because the word has been lost in most places within our societies, and there's a whole load of historic reasons why that could be the case. But the fact is, we talk about leadership, but we don't talk about eldership. And the reason why this is so vital for leaders to grasp this is if you make leadership the top of the mountain, then you are creating a glass ceiling for yourself. And that's my concern. Business schools, executive development are herding people into this thing called leadership, not understanding that that is not the end of the road. It's actually on the road to this thing called eldership. So in terms of defining it, let me tell you two stories. The first one I heard from a guy called Steve Chalk in his latest book about Rabbi Akiva, who lived at the end of the first, beginning of the second century. So Rabbi Akiva went to the marketplace every day in his little village and got his groceries, and then he would walk home with his groceries. And the way home for him was out of the village, down the road, reach a crossroads, and turn right, and there would be his house. So one day his head is so busy. He does this every day. It's like driving your car. You don't even notice where you've gone. His head is lost in thinking about something. Buys his food, starts walking down the way home, isn't thinking where he's going, doesn't turn right, carries straight on. He's awoken into his consciousness by someone shouting at him, "Stop! Who are you? And why are you here?" So the rabbi kind of comes to consciousness and he looks up at this guy and he says to this guy, he said, "How much do you get paid for shouting out those two questions?" And the guy says, "I get paid 5 drachmas a week." So the rabbi said, "I will double that. I will give you 10 drachmas a week if you come back to my house and stand outside my door. And every morning when I come out of that house, shout those two questions at me. Who are you? And why are you here?" And I love that story because I think they are the two most foundational questions that I think all of us should live by every day. Who are you and why are you here? So the who are you question is, the ancients always believed that you were not just born as a biological blob on the earth. You were born with a purpose. The Greeks called it your daemon. The Romans called it your genius. People like in our generation, Ken Robinson, have called it your element. Other people working on that, they call it like the soul's code or the acorn theory. So historically, people have always had this sense of when you are born, you have a sense, an image, an idea born within you like an acorn seed of why you're in the world. So who are you is a vital question for any of us to be asking every day. And the second question, why are you here, is the question of our humanity. Is, we're here, we exist on this planet to fulfill whatever that acorn is, and it's for the benefit of others. And of course, we benefit as we fulfill that acorn, but it's for the benefit of others. So what it means to be human is we exist for the benefit of others. So that rabbi wanting to be asked those two questions every day is pivotal to where this idea of eldership comes from, because that's what elders do. They ask you those questions. Now, let me tell you the second story. So my friend Peter Hawkins, he's the professor of leadership at one of the top UK business schools, Henley Business School. He was called in by Nelson Mandela back in 1995 to work with the new government. And remember, Mandela, when he became president, said, I'll only serve 5 years, one term. So Peter Hawkins, one day, who's working with these government ministers, and this is 1999, so it's kind of moving towards the latter stages. He's flying from Johannesburg down to Cape Town with the foreign minister, Alfred Bethaluxu Nzuo. So he's flying down, and they're chatting about this and that. And Alfred says to Peter Hawkins, he said, actually, I'm going to step down when Mandela does at the end of this term. So Peter Hawkins says to him, well, you know, I totally get that. You know, you've given so much, you've sacrificed so much to get into government and in government. And Alfred had been showing pictures of his kids and grandkids and saying, great, you know, you can go and spend time with the grandkids now. It'd be brilliant. Anyway, the foreign minister stops in silence, stares at Peter Hawkins and says, you just don't understand our culture. He said, I don't retire. He said, I now become an elder. He said, in my culture, when you step down from leadership, you become an elder. He said, my job is now to hold the government to account. My job is to say to the new ministers, why are you doing that? Why are you really doing that? No, why are you really, really doing that? To ask the deep and difficult questions, to challenge them and to support them to be the best leaders that they can be. And just in parenthesis there, Raul Koza, who writes about Let Africa Lead, and the model of leadership that Mandela used is what ended apartheid, not a Western model of leadership. You can come back to that in the Q&A a bit more. But he said that leaders are formed in the cradle of eldership, and which underlines Mandela. So I did a lot of work around Mandela. So my second book, Becoming Mandela, was all the work that I'd done looking at Mandela. You see that Mandela, two things. One is that the Mandela that we came to respect and love was not the Mandela of earlier years. He became Mandela. He grew into, became that person. And he did that because from birth to death, Mandela was surrounded by elders. He was formed in the conversation he had with these elders in his life. So Mandela always knew he'd become an elder. He always knew that his presidency was not the end of the road for him. He always knew that something lies beyond leadership, and it's called eldership. And I think the key issue is we, certainly in the West, I think in a lot of places, live by a model of life that I call the three-phase model. And I think it's where the damage is being caused. See, the three-phase model is you have the phase one is you get educated. Phase two is you successful. And then phase three is you retire and then you die. But that is not the model of growing up and of society that has been around for thousands of years. It's slightly different in different cultures, but essentially it's actually a four-phase model. And the four-phase model is this. You still go and get educated. You still go out there and accumulate and get successful. But by the time you're around 50, the elders come to you and start saying, it's time to move on now. It's time that you now get beyond your own ego, that you release your ego attachments to all this success and accumulation, that you crystallize all the wisdom that you've got over these years and turn it into something of wisdom that is useful for your peers and the upcoming generation, which leads into the fourth phase is you are an elder now in that community. So I've tried to give you a big bit of background. So if I was to land on a definition, it's this: an elder is someone who has crystallized or turned their lifetime experience into deep wisdom. And they invest that deep wisdom in the lives of young people, of leaders, of organizations and societies to help them thrive and leave a legacy that's going to outlive them, that benefits the world. So that would be where I land in terms of definition.
Yeah. Thank you. And I'm curious, as you have conversations around this topic with people at various stages of their lives, and I'm thinking, particularly people who, if we think about people who are in their 20s and 30s and are trying to identify what their purpose might look like, um and answers to those questions like who are you even might be a very difficult thing from somebody earlier on in their life. And I've also talked to people a lot older than their 30s and 40s that are still grappling with these
Yep.
questions. But at what stage of life, should one start actively thinking about this idea of legacy and eldership, and what does that actually look like? So you mentioned that Mandela, uh, you know, viewed himself as an elder, even eventually becoming an elder, even before he
Yes.
stepped into the role as presidency. What does that look like to view yourself as an eventual elder earlier on in your life?
Yeah, good question. Um, there's a guy called Michael Mead who I highly commend to you, both his books and his podcasts, because I think he's bringing perspectives that nobody else is bringing right now in the world. He said this, he said, when a society abandons its elders, the elders abandon themselves. When a society abandons its elders, the elders abandon themselves. So I think underlying your question, our society is caught in this, I don't know what the word is, vicious circle. In other words, I've not heard anyone talking about eldership. So as I grow up, I don't hear anyone talking about eldership. All I hear them is, educate, success, accumulate, retire. That's all I hear them talk about. So if society has abandoned the whole idea of eldership, it means that the elders in that society, potential elders, aren't even thinking about eldership. They don't see themselves as eldership. They don't know what to do or where to begin. So, I mean, that's kind of what I've committed myself to in this whole phase of my life, is to how do we reawaken this issue of eldership, because we're caught in this vicious cycle. So how I think it's like a lot of things. I think Picasso said, everyone's an artist, but basically as adults, we kind of just crush it out of them. I think the same is true of eldership. I knew at the age of 8 or 9 that there was something going on in Biafra where people were starving. And me and a couple of friends got together in our primary school class, and we set up our school's Save the Children Fund club to raise money for Biafra. So fast forward that, my wife and I, when I was leading Emerging Leaders, I was asked to go and speak into a very prominent public school. And I was given an afternoon with 11 and 12-year-olds, which was a frightening experience for me. And but one of the things I said to them, I said, look, what is going on in the world that makes you angry? What is going on in the world that makes you say, this is not okay? This is not okay. I said, have a think about it, have a little chat with the people next to you, and then I'll take your answers. So they did. There's a lot of chat and buzzing backwards and forwards. Now, in my mind, I thought, when I say, okay, give me some answers, I'm going to get the same answer from all 120 of them, because I thought groupthink will come into play. But I was wrong. So I said to them, so what are your answers? Hand went up, climate change. Hand goes up. I've heard about this whole issue of trafficking. And I got a whole room of different answers. Now, what does that tell me? It tells me that 11-year-olds are tuned into the world in which they live. And I think it underlies this notion we are born with this acorn, with this mission, daemon, genius, call it whatever you will. there is that within us that wants to get into the world and make an impact. In fact, if you look at the brain of a human teenager, it wants to make an impact. The question is, how early? Well, 6 years old, 9 years old, 11 years old. You could ask that question to any young person and they'll have an answer. What happens is we learn in our society to stop valuing their answers and dismiss their response. I mean, thank God for people like Greta Thunberg who didn't listen to the culture. But she has emerged as a young elder in a particular area. Simon Sinek, who we all know, getting to the why and all that, he said this: why do you need to wait until you are 70 years old to worry about your legacy? Why aren't you worrying about it when you're 21? See, the issue of eldership should be hardwired into our very map of life. So I would be teaching 11-year-olds, look, this is the map of life. You're going to get educated, you're going to get opportunity, and then there is this. Mandela knew that. He knew it with his mother's milk, that there was more beyond leadership. So his elders would be interacting with him. His elders would be encouraging him. It was one of the elders at South Africa that spotted him and spotted his genius, as it were, and said, come with me. And he then started mentoring him and walking alongside and nourishing him. If you look at what happened on Robben Island every day, at lunchtime when they were breaking rocks or whatever on Robben Island, they would get together and Mandela would have the elders around him and they'd be having all these debates about what the future would be looking like. And one of the things the elders are doing is challenging the ego. Now, this is not about you, Nelson. What is it about the nation? So you have that level of interaction all the way through his life, where you've got these people who are encouraging you and challenging you. So I think it's key that, legacy, Simon Sinek said, you shouldn't wait till you're 70. Some people talk about legacy like it's a badge that you should stick on your life at some point late on. I would say this: legacy is your life. It's why you're here. Why are you on the planet? And that's a question from from year 0 years old onwards. Why are you on the planet? What are you here for? What is the way you are going to benefit the planet? Because in doing that, you will benefit. By becoming fully who you are is tied up with the contribution that you're going to make into the world. So legacy should be built into us from the beginning. And I, like I said, I think the issue is it can be, but we breed it out of young people. One of the reasons why I created the Youth Compass Project, I took all of the research I'd done that turned into the book and the podcast, Becoming Mandela. I took all of that and I created what's called the Youth Compass Project. And it's available free for any young person in the world online. Is all of those principles of who Mandela became are all learnable by anybody. So it's one way that I've tried to engage in saying, look, you can start this young. We need to start this young. And the reason why it's important, and the reason why I called it Youth Compass Project, is having that grip on who you are and why you're here is like a compass. You hold out a compass and it always shows you where north is. So you hold out this compass when someone offers you a new job and you say, does this fit the compass? Or, this offer of a huge salary. I remember talking with a guy I worked in the corporate world. I was in one of the top banks in the London branch, and we were chatting. And I said to him at one point, I said, can I just pause the conversation? I said, you keep on telling me I don't want this and I don't want that and I don't want this and I don't want that. This is a very, very successful 30-something. And he said, yeah, he said, I don't know what I want. He said, they came to me at university. They saw I was clever. They offered me obscene amounts of money to come and join the bank. And that's it. He said, I'm now saying, who am I? What am I about? And so that existential, and he said, the problem is now, he said, I built a whole lifestyle, earned on obscene amounts of money, and I've kind of lost myself and lost my way. Now, having a compass as early as you can in life allows you to say, is this the right direction? Is this a good step? Is this a good move? So a wonderful talk, you can get it with Michael Mead if you go onto his podcast. He did it recently. He says, your call doesn't stop calling. So if you take it that your calling on your life was there when you were a young kid, what he's saying is it's still calling. It's not changed. It might have a different flavor or whatever to it because times and context, etc. But what he's saying is your call is still calling you. So I think you can begin this move towards eldership as soon as you can. And we should encourage young people to begin as soon as they can.
Thank you. And yeah, maybe one or two other questions, but would love to open it up to the audience as well. So if anybody does have questions, please do feel free to raise your virtual hand or post the question in the chat. But maybe building off of some of what you shared, Trevor, I'd love to maybe extend it a bit further. When you gave the definition of eldership earlier, you talked about really distilling this lifetime of accumulated knowledge. And then stepping aside and passing that knowledge along to younger generations. And so I'm curious to hear, what methods you'd recommend for effectively doing that wisdom sharing, especially between elders and younger generations.
Yeah, it's a great and a very good question. And to be honest, it's one I struggle with all the time. And one of the questions when I'm doing this research with people at the moment, I say, what are the channels? What are the channels that we need to connect between olders and youngers to help this conversation take place? And I think with a lot of things, it's start with what's there. So for me, one of the things I did is, when I handed over the leadership of emerging leaders to Steve, I contacted an international youth organization called One Young World. And I worked with them because they have representatives of young people from literally every country in the world. They're a bit like the Olympic Games with that. And I just said to them, look, this is my background. Here's my experience. And is there anything I can do to offer myself to some of your young ambassadors around the world? And particularly those who are in very tough non-Western countries. And they bit my hand off. And I think I ended up mentoring people from about 18 different countries and still have a relationship where I teach some of those ambassadors to be mentors themselves to other people. So one is to just reach out, if there's a local youth group, is to be able to say to people, look, I only have a certain amount of experience, a certain amount of wisdom, but I'm here. What can I do? Another friend of mine I spoke to, he said he was chatting with some people at a college, and he just said to them, where do you go to gather wisdom and just draw off wisdom? They said, we don't have anywhere. And he just said, would it be helpful if I met with you once a month or once every few months, and we just had a conversation like this where we could just draw off one another's wisdom? And they bit his hand off. So some of it's kind of start where you are. For me, another thing was the Youth Compass Project, and I've created that as a mechanism that an older person could sit down and use it as a mentoring agenda, if you like, with a younger person. So that sits there as something I created to try and answer that question. But the other thing is somehow embedding mentoring in your culture. I mean, your organizational culture, your local culture. And I really, when I was working a lot in Malawi, there's two organizations that work a lot in Malawi that I have huge affection for. So one was called SCOM, or stood for the Student Christian Organization of Malawi. But the reason why I like them and I worked with them is they had young people representatives in every country, every school in the country. And their whole principle was, as you get older in the school and when you leave school, as soon as you leave the school, you become a mentor back to the school. And the other organization is CAMFED. and works with girls in a number of African countries, doing amazing work. But they have built mentoring into their whole way of working. So every young girl that they work with becomes a mentor to a younger person. So building mentoring into the system. So within the English system, around 16, you've got to decide which subjects you're going to study at school in order to go on to university. Well, the 18-year-old at school could mentor the 16-year-olds. The 16-year-olds could be mentoring the 13-year-olds who are trying to decide what their first level options are going to be. Those who go to university could be mentoring the sixth formers. There is no reason why we couldn't begin to start creating embedded mentoring systems, because what that tells young people from the start is that this kind of conversation between the elders and the youngers is normal. It's normal. And by that, we can then begin to, Michael Mead said, when society abandons its elders, it's one way that we can begin to recover elders back into our systems and organizations. So that's just 3 ideas off my head, but I'm always looking for where are the living connections. And the biggest thing is, and I say the hardest thing is for an older person to have the courage to believe that they actually have something to offer and offer it. Just like all my mentors, I've had to go and ask them. Most of the mentoring that I do, I've had to offer it and say, if you would like a conversation at some point, I'm here. So they're my first thoughts, Triston, on that.
Thank you. And maybe one final question, and then I'll open it up to the audience. And John, I received your message. Thank you for sending that. If you'd like, after this question, you can go ahead and unmute your line and pose the question directly, or if you'd prefer, I can read it on your behalf either way. But maybe Trevor, just one last question before opening it up. Would love to hear any, a lot of the people who have dialed in for this call, obviously very interested in this topic of eldership. And I'm curious what advice you might have for people who are uncertain about what that path towards eldership might look like for them.
Yeah, thank you. It's all about heart and character. It's all about heart and character. If you look at the great leadership failures, even of our generation, most of it are not failures of skill or knowledge. They are failures of heart and character. So the biggest investment we can make is in our heart and character. And the great thing is that life is like a classroom. It's like a classroom that you attend every single day. Every single day, stuff happens. And it gives us an opportunity to develop heart and character. By heart, what I mean is, who am I existing for? Am I doing all this just for me to make me feel safer and better about myself? Or am I about something bigger than me? So that's the heart issue. And the character issue are the choices that I make every single day. And because we used to have a joke story we told with emerging leaders, was it starts with a cup of coffee, because you say, how does a leader become so dysfunctional or corrupt? And we used to say it starts with a cup of coffee, because I used to tell a story of once when I was in a restaurant, cafe, and I'd ordered a cup of coffee and hadn't paid, and sat there. They took away my cup. A new waitress came on, gave me another cup of coffee. Or I went to pay, and the bill just said 1 cup of coffee. And the question is then, at that point, what are you going to do? Are you just going to pretend you only had 1 cup of coffee because that's all the bill says? Or are you going to actually say to them, excuse me, I actually had 2 cups of coffee? And I always say that I didn't give them 2 cups of coffee for their own economics in the cafe, even though that's good. I said I did it for my own heart, because I knew that if I lied to myself and them a little thing, then it's not such a big thing to do that on a bigger thing. And it's true of every dimension of our character. It's the little things we do every day that accumulate, and that will become your legacy. I think if I asked any of you to name someone who died recently that you really loved and respected, and it might be someone you knew personally or in the media or whatever, and I said to you, give me 2 or 3 words that sum up what was it about them, I can almost guarantee you that over 90% of the responses will be about heart and character, because people don't forget who you were and how they made you feel and what investment and impact they made on your life. That is the essence of heart and character. And again, just another little Mandela story that's worth noting. Every single day on Robben Island, Mandela took 20 minutes to examine his heart and character. Every day. He did that work on himself because he knew that if he did not become a person who was trustworthy, he would never create trust within his leadership. So that would be my first thought on that, Triston.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And we'll open it up to questions, and maybe I'll begin just with one question that came to us from John, who's tuned in from Nairobi, Kenya. And the question, there's a few parts to it, but I think it's many great components of this question. Is eldership a preset growth from leadership first? So basically, does one have to be in that leadership position before transitioning into this eldership position? And also, is it confined and defined to a specific age, or can a young person who's very experienced in certain life experiences be an elder? So that's kind of the first part of the question. And a second part of the question being, in this age of social media where there are many people sharing their crystallized lifetime experiences, what defines and really supports effective and impactful leadership or eldership?
Wow, great. Thanks, John. And hi, Nairobi. I think one of the things we just need to be clear when we talk about leadership, there are all kinds of leadership. We talk about thought leadership, we talk about moral leadership, there is organizational leadership. So does everyone need to be a leader of an organization to be an elder? No. The definition of leadership that I have used right from the beginning of Emerging Leaders was from Howard Gardner at Harvard. He said, leadership is the ability to create a story that affects the thoughts, feelings, and actions of others. If you are generating a story that is benefiting the lives of other people, then you are leading. And you might be doing that through the way that you live. You might be doing it quietly, not in some big shouty kind of way. You might be doing it in some big kind of way, formally, informally. So I think it comes probably from leadership in the widest sense of that word. In terms of age, I think I've touched on that, is as far as I'm concerned, you can't start early enough to start helping young people have a different model of growing up, the 4-phase model, not a 3-phase model. So they would be my first thoughts on that.
Awesome. Thank you, Trevor. Forge, I'll turn it over to you if you want to unmute your line and pose your question.
Sure. Thank you. Hi, Trevor. Trevor, I guess my question that I'm still kind of uncertain about is the difference between mentoring and eldering. So you've mentored me, but you've also probably eldered me, and I would definitely not probably, you have. And throughout my life, I've looked to mentor people, and so I just don't quite work out what the difference is, other than that you gain more experience along that route.
That's a great question.
So what's the difference? And did Nelson Mandela stop mentoring and only elder it after his presidency?
I don't know what he did every day. What I do know is he formed.
No, sure.
I do know he formed the global elders. That was part of his legacy. Yeah. So if you say, what did Mandela want to leave us behind after his death? He wanted to leave us with an embedded understanding of global elders. So he certainly did that, and he acted as an elder to the board of elders. In other words, So he became an elder to all of those global elders in their mission. In terms of individual conversations, I can only imagine that the answer is yes from the stuff I know and have heard. So
what's the difference between mentoring and elder?
So one way I would look at it, I would say every elder is a mentor, but not every mentor is an elder. So a mentor, generally speaking, is someone who either has a little bit more experience or a little bit more wisdom and can sit down with you and have a conversation that is for your benefit. So there is bad mentoring where the mentor sits down and you say, look, I got this problem, and they just talk at you for the next hour and say, when I was a boy and when I did this, and it's all about them actually and making them feel good. So that's bad mentoring. Good mentoring is they help you think about you. So I think the mentoring is a shape of conversation. I think it's a style of conversation where you are using your crystallized experience to help them look at their issue. And the way we use experience is not necessarily by telling you about me and my story, is I use my experience to ask you good questions. So I think the mentoring is the mechanism for a conversation. I think what the elder does that's different than just mentoring is the level of question that they are asking you. So if I am in a more eldering role with someone, I will be asking them questions that they're not asking right now. And by that is I'm not ignoring them. I'm trying to listen at a higher level or a deeper level. And so I will, and some of them may even experience it, me saying to someone at this point, okay, I hear all that, but why are you on the planet? Why do you exist here on this earth? Now, that's an elder question. So the level of question that we're asking, and I think that's what's missing, is we have loads of mentors all over the place. But do we have elders who are asking why do people exist? I went to the local village harvest festival service the other day where you celebrate the incoming of the harvest. And there was something about and there was only 20 people in the church, and someone was saying, we're going to have a meeting to talk about how do we get people into church. And that's the whole focus of their discussion. How do we get people into church? And my response was, I said, it's the wrong question. And what I did is like, where did that idea even come from? And it was never about trying to get people into a building. It was never about that. So the idea of the elder, I think, is asking those questions. Why does your organization exist? You take an investment bank like Deutsche Bank. You ask young people, which I have done, and said, look, why does Deutsche Bank exist in the world? And they'll say, oh, shareholder value. And I said, so you your brightest 0.0001% educated people in the world are coming to work each day to make a bunch of shareholders rich. Is that why you do? And they go, oh, no. I said, well, why does Deutsche Bank exist? And they said, well, we don't really know. And I took them back in their history and I said, look, back in history, at a time where Germany had been absolutely decimated and was humiliated by having to just borrow money. And a couple of guys got together and said, how do we use our wealth so that we as Germans can create a pot of wealth that people can set up their own businesses to lead themselves out of poverty? So I said, the reason that Deutsche Bank originally existed was to help people out of poverty. Now, is it about that now? And these are elder questions. So why do you exist? Why did this begin? What is this about? So I think that's the difference for me, Steve. What's the level of question? So I have a few elders in my life. And one thing is, when I'm talking about something, they will always ask me a question that I think, have you not been listening to what I just said? And then the question lands and I think, oh my goodness, they've just taken this conversation to a whole other level and helping me to even look at it in a whole new way. So I think that's probably how I would look at that, Steve.
Thank you. That's great. Cheers.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Jane, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, Trevor. I'm conscious of time, so it's probably a quick one, but fabulous so far. My question is, how do we ignite the desire for eldership in others and ourselves, do you think?
Yes. I wish I knew the answer other than, I think to me, inspiration. So I have been inspired by people along my lifespan. So I encountered an elder in my life when I was 19. And he is now in his 80s, and we still meet. And he inspired me. So I think it's we have to create, one is the knowledge that eldership exists. So conversations like this and talking about it, and just getting it onto people's kind of thinking plateau is one thing. But the other is experiencing it. So I have elders for different things in my life, and I count myself very privileged because they bring a depth of wisdom that I aspire to. When I'm with them, I think, my goodness, I want to be like you. And I think the whole ancient model of discipleship was built on that. It was, look, here is someone that you could be like. If you get close enough to them, you could be like them. And that's my experience of working with elders. So having elders in my life has certainly inspired me. And that's intentional. I have to go and find those people. And I have done. And in some cases, it's taken me years to find the right people. But finding them, getting it on our consciousness and talking about it, and I think challenging people. Like, well, so what are you doing? I remember talking to a retiring executive recently who was retiring, and they had done some phenomenal pioneering things. And they're off playing golf now. And I just said, whoa. I said, the young people that I mentor in Africa, I said, they would almost bite your hand off to have the amount of wisdom that's in your little fingernail. And they're desperate for people like you. So I was pretty challenging at that point. So
thank you, Trevor. I
right.
have to go, sadly, but that's beautiful.
All right.
So
thanks, Jane. Thanks.
All right. Thank you. Richardson, I see you have your hand raised. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, Trevor, thank you for speaking with us this morning, and Triston, thank you for inviting me and sharing the info about this event. Trevor, can you elaborate on your understanding of purpose in terms of eldership? I ask because later this month I turn 30, and birthdays are usually a time of reflection. And I'm curious if I should think of my purpose as the kind of elder I'd want to become in the future. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, 100%. I would be thinking that. And to me, that is the base. There's two things that are certain. One is you're going to die, and the other is you are going to become someone. So the question then is, if I'm living an intentional life, if I am leading my own life, is, so who am I going to become? What do I want to be? Who do I want to be? What heart? What character? What do I want my kids to say about me? What do I want the people that I've worked with to say about me? And I know those of you who are old enough to remember Stephen Covey's 7 Habits has got this wonderful exercise that you do, of reliving your 80th birthday, and 3 people standing up and talking about you. And all of that was based on, who do you want to become? So I think that intentional search for who you want to become, and that's why I did so the book Becoming Mandela, and there's a whole podcast series with it, is just on that issue. Who are you becoming? But I would also dig deeper and just say, and this is my personal conviction from history, is you were born with a purpose. You don't have to invent it. You have to, like a detective, go and detect it. and the clues will be there. If you go back and think about your life, what's affected you, what caught your attention, when you felt your heart expand and get excited, when you felt your heart contract and think, ugh, no. My hunch is there will be clues. There will be clues. So I think to go back and I use the Greek word, the daemon, and that's not demon, that's daemon, D-I-A-M. That notion of, so what is that within me that I came into the world into play? So I think that, along with who am I becoming, a focus on heart and character, would be a very sure compass to guide you through. And the other interesting thing is, you said you're turning 30, is there's been lots of work done around transitions in life, and 30 is one of those life transitions, is that the body and the psyche kind of begin to just slow down and begin to start going, oh, okay, this ain't going to go on forever. So you are in a transition. So transitions are brilliant points of doing this kind of work. So I applaud you and encourage you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm mindful of time. We do have one more question that came through in the chat, but Trevor, I want to be mindful of your time. Do you still have a moment for that
I'm fine.
question?
I'm absolutely fine. I'm mindful of everybody else's, but I'm absolutely fine.
Great. Roberto, would you like to pose your question?
Sure, sounds good. And thank you very much again for creating this dialogue and the space for this. I was wondering, since I've worked in politics and I see some of the polarization that has resulted in our society, what are some ways to create a culture of eldership in this increasingly polarized society?
Yeah, a good question. That question weighs on me every day, Roberto. And I seek each day to live on the side of hope rather than despair on that question. I think part of it comes back to this: we've got to break into the vicious cycle. So when I remind myself of that, that it kind of helps me to say, okay, it's just going to take some courage and intentionality, Trevor. You just got to begin these conversations. You just got to start. So one way, even in politics, is to get a bunch of politicians together and just say, who do we respect? Who have we respected? Who are the political characters in history that we respect? And then the second question is, what is it about them that we respected? And grow that conversation. Then the third bit would be to then say to the group, let's take one issue that we are facing, one policy issue that we are facing right now. What would these elders or elder statespeople of politics, what would they say to us right now? And that way you can enact an elder conversation, even for the current politicians. Because somehow politics is caught in I think it's caught in a management paradigm. I don't even think it's caught in a leadership paradigm. If it was caught in a leadership paradigm, we would be working much more across party rather than one party. We would be thinking 50 years ahead, not 5 minutes ahead. You know, the Native American Indians, every decision they made was based on 7 generations. What impact will this decision have 7 generations from now? So I think just that question, that's an elder question. All right, you say you want to do this. How will that play out in 7 generations? So I think creating conversations, Roberto, connecting people with that, connecting existing politicians with people that they respect, as a way of creating courage, because that's what it needs, courage. Courage is a leadership issue, and you can learn, you can grow courage. But without courage, we will not shift the current political management paradigms into leadership and elder paradigms. Just to close on that, I was asked to speak into the National Health Service in the UK, and across the middle of the UK, Midlands, speak at a conference. And I started by saying, how many of you worked under leaders in the National Health Service that you admired greatly, who are now retired, but you admired greatly? Most hands went up. So I said, my next question is, how many of those people do you currently invite into your strategy meetings to talk around and get perspective? And about 1 or 2 hands went up. And I think there's the problem. We are abandoning the elders abandon themselves, and we get stuck in this. So I think, Roberto, you and I just got to have courage and do some things that break this cycle.
Thank you.
All right. Well,
Thank you.
Yeah. So I don't see any other chats or questions in the chat or hands that are raised virtually. So with that, thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you, John Forge, Jane Richardson, Roberto, for the questions. And maybe just in closing, Trevor, was there anything else that you wanted to share with the group or any parting thoughts?
First of all, thank you for giving up the time to have this conversation. My encouragement to you is just go and tell people about the conversation and start conversations. I think that's what we can all do. And I think aspire to be an elder is a great aspiration.
Well, thank you so much, Trevor. And thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.
All right. And thank you, Triston.